For the first time ever, they decided that they should probably integrate DeFi, essentially remove the centralized infrastructure from the equation. They released this new feature, which is essentially crypto-backed loans. Anyone that has like BTC, for example, goes to the Coinbase app and can take a loan in USD. And that's very cool in the sense that it's the first time ever we have a large-scale consumer app that completely abstracts away DeFi, that integrates with DeFi. Users don't even have to know it's DeFi behind the scenes.
Hey everyone, quick disclaimer before we get into today's episode. Nothing said on Expansion is a recommendation to buy or sell securities or tokens. This podcast is for informational purposes only, and any views expressed by anyone on the show are solely our opinions, not financial advice. Our guests and I may hold positions in the companies, funds, or projects discussed. Expansion was kickstarted by a grant from the Celestia Foundation. All right, on with the show. All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of Expansion. Today, I'm joined by the CEO of Morpho, Paul Frambot. Paul, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is going to be a fun one. So you and I are talking a day after a pretty crazy 76 hours in crypto with the launch of Trump token and Melania and several other meme coins. But before we get into, I want to get your take on American DeFi and some more topical stuff as well. But I want to discuss a big announcement that came out last week, which is this partnership that Morpho has with Coinbase, which, I mean, we talked about it a little bit offline. I definitely nerded out about it, but I thought it was a massive announcement and something very, very cool. This kind of concept that I think Bankless used to talk quite a bit about, this DeFi mullet of CeFi in the front and DeFi in the back. And I think it has a bunch of really cool implications, not only for crypto today, but maybe it gives you a little bit of a glimpse into the future of how we can see some of the CeFi and TradFi and DeFi relationships playing out in the long term. But before we start to unpack some of the longer term implications, can you just give us an overview of what this partnership is that Morpho has with Coinbase?
For sure. So I guess the idea is simply that, Coinbase is producing this consumer app that everyone uses in order to like buy crypto, trade crypto, and maybe take loans and those kind of things. And before, they used to do it with centralized technology. Like essentially they had their servers that they run internally, do the accounting internally, all those kind of things. And for the first time ever, they decided that they should probably integrate DeFi on Base in order to essentially remove the centralized infrastructure from the equation and directly have the user interact with Morpho on Base, right? So they released this new feature, which is essentially crypto-backed loans, where anyone that has like BTC, for example, goes to the Coinbase app and can take a loan in USD. And behind the scenes, what's going to happen is that a wallet is going to be created. BTC is going to be wrapped in CBBTC on Base. Then CBBTC is going to be deposited on Morpho. A loan is going to be taken, and the USDC is deposited in the Coinbase account. And that's very cool in the sense that it's the first time ever we have a large-scale consumer app that completely abstracts away DeFi, that integrates with DeFi, right? And with not even the concept of wallet, of chain, gas, whatsoever. Users don't even have to know it's DeFi behind the scenes.
Yeah, and one of the reasons that I think this is very cool is, this is solving this very core need that users have, which is they want to get some amount of liquidity on Bitcoin that they have. And when you go back to the 2019 to 2022 cycle, the options that you had for this was Celsius or BlockFi. And both of those were extremely centralized solutions, obviously with no small amount of risk. So it's very cool. Like from just a sort of construction perspective here, what is the upgrade that users are getting now that there's a DeFi component to this on the back end?
Yeah, for sure. So I think from a consumer and user experience perspective, the point is that nothing should change. It should be at feature parity with something like BlockFi or Celsius, etc. Now, what do they benefit from plugging into an open infrastructure? Well, essentially, you have, I'd say, three main things, right? The first thing is transparency, right? Like we've gone through BlockFi, Celsius, FTX, etc. They all had margin engines that was not transparent about like how the margin of the collateral was handled. Effectively, the collateral was rehypothecated and reused like somewhere else. Here, you have very clear guarantees on where your collateral is, right? And in that case, Coinbase decided not to rehypothecate it. It's on-chain, idle. And you don't have to trust Coinbase. Like you can actually verify it directly on chain. So that's is like a big, massive upgrade compared to like the days of like 2021, 2022, where like things started to blow up on like the centralized finance side. The second upgrade is technically for Coinbase, they're just leveraging open source code, right? So integrating Morpho with like the Morpho stack has been like super easy for them. Like the code was already built, already audited like countless times. And, you know, like if you're an exchange and you want to build a margin engine like Morpho, on-chain, it takes a lot of time, right? It takes a lot of time and resources. And now they can just simply reuse the code that has been, already developed by Morpho and is open, which is, seems trivial, but in the CeFi world, they all have to rebuild every time the same components over and over again. And so usually the process is like, I wait for an exchange to release the margin engine feature, and then I go poach like the 20 devs that worked on it, and I try to rebuild the same thing, right? And so you have those like economies of scale in terms of like software development that were not possible before. And then the third advantage for users that will, effectively, those are not direct advantages for users. They just eventually get reflected in the pricing, just because like things are cheaper to integrate. And so this last component is essentially the liquidity, right? If Coinbase were to build this internally, they would have to manage liquidity. They would have to bring the lending side in order to get bars on the app. And now they can plug on the Morpho network, right? Morpho already has like, currently 6.5 billion deposited in the protocol, and they can essentially borrow from this liquidity, right? That has been provided in the network. And so essentially they don't have to build the book, right? Which is a big complex problem when you're trying to provide leverage or lending in an exchange.
Okay, so I want to discuss a couple of those. So just to highlight the transparency component here, that is enormous. So if you're around during this 2021 cycle timeframe, there was an enormous amount of trust that got placed in, especially the Celsiuses and the BlockFis of the world, and you had no idea where the yield was coming from. These uncollateralized loans that were being given to the Three Arrows Capitals of the world with basically extremely low due diligence, right? That was being done on these funds. So when these funds blew up, you were massively at risk, and a lot of people lost a lot of money in these platforms. So just being able to transparently see your funds on chain is a huge 0-to-1 sort of step change, improvement, I think, for users actually. And I want to talk about that second point as well, because it might seem a little bit of like a back end mechanical point, but I think it's a pretty big one. And this also gets at the design of Morpho here, where you guys have a little bit more of a modular design in terms of maybe comparing to something like an Aave, which is a bit more of a managed product where risk is managed by the the core team. Like you guys specifically designed the protocol to with this idea that big fintechs or the CeFis or the TradFis of the world were going to want to use some of their own architecture, and so you designed it in a very modular way. Talk a little bit about that design philosophy and why how Morpho has been designed to accommodate these types of use cases specifically.
Sure. So I think the most important thing, if you're a big institution like building and you want to leverage like DeFi infrastructure, you want it to be resilient. Obviously you don't want hacks. You want it to be flexible enough to cater to your specific needs, and you want it to be efficient, right? Like at least as efficient as your current service. Otherwise, you don't switch to decentralized tech, right? And I think the Morpho stack provides like this customizability where if you're Coinbase, you can essentially tailor to what you want or need. For example, Coinbase, they don't want their assets to be rehypothecated, right? So that's great. They can do that on the Morpho stack. But most importantly, when doing so, they can be in control. And I think this is widely understated in DeFi, but because we're targeting, like for now, consumers as an industry, but the more we talk to institutional, the very key thing that they want is ownership, right? What that means is that they want to be in control of the risk. They want to be in control of the code, right? So if you interact with an Aave and the code is upgradable, well, essentially, as Coinbase, you're introducing a backdoor in your own system, right? Another team that's not your team And whatever the trust assumptions you make about this team, if it's decentralized, if it's a set of token holders, a multi-sig, whatever, it's not your team, right? And so you introduce this backdoor in your system. So it has to be immutable. This way, you own the code completely. And to the extent that Ethereum or the layer 2 is resilient and decentralized, like the code won't change. So that's a key, like, important piece. On the code side of things, you have the same thing from the risk side of things. You want people to be able to control their exposure to the risk and essentially like customize what they want. I will say, though, that too much customizability can be detrimental, right? If you have full modularity and as a protocol, you just provide the code library, well, then Coinbase is going to build something that extremely tailored to their use case. And then no one is going to be on the other side of the market, right? Because it's a new, fresh market created specifically for Coinbase. So now they have to bootstrap the lending side. In the case of Coinbase, they picked an existing market, so CBBTC to borrow USDC, that already existed and that already had ton of liquidity, like literally tens of millions of liquidity. And so this way on day one, they can, take loans, etc. So it's important to be able to cater to the needs of institutional. But if we just don't want to reduce DeFi to being just a code library that is stateless and without value in the network, then it's better if there is some nuances to the customizability that you offer to the end player.
Got it. So yeah, this is the on the spectrum here of giving someone absolutely no options and infinite options. You kind of want to meet somewhere in the middle on that spectrum and maybe try to anticipate what the biggest use cases are going to the biggest sort of bucket of use cases are going to be and try to balance that a little bit. End of day.
Exactly. You want to be aggregating network effects as much as you can because they're very valuable when it comes to providing liquidity, efficient pricing, this kind of things. I'm hopeful as players become more and more clever and more active, you can offer even more modularity because the clever players in DeFi will re-aggregate liquidity and fragmentation. It's just that we have to, offering too much modularity too quickly, in my opinion, can be detrimental. And so it has to be progressive with the complexity of the user base and of the people managing positions in DeFi.
Paul, so, I want to talk a little bit about the specifics of this deal. And, obviously share no state secrets, et cetera. But, this was a massive accomplishment for Morpho here. It's a huge, huge deal. We talked about offline. Feel it's very cool to just watch the accomplishment here. And I think users or listeners would be very interested in just what does it look like to actually what was kind of the genesis of this deal? How did it start with Coinbase? I'm sure it was probably a relatively new thing for a startup like Morpho to sell into essentially a big fintech like Coinbase. So tell us a little bit about how the genesis of this deal, how did it get started, and what was it like basically, constructing this partnership with such a large organization?
Sure. So I guess a few things. So first, I think Coinbase, some time back wanted to had already in mind this idea of we want to build a super app that connects to our super infrastructure. So that was already clear in their minds that, and it's no secret to anyone, they've been quite public about it. It's just they want to bring Coinbase on chain, progressively. And so a very natural way to do this is obviously you're going to plug on DeFi on Base because they have Base. And then the question is what's the lending and borrowing infrastructure that is relevant for them, right? And so it was a while back actually that they started looking into this, and they thought about what would be the best possible partner to integrate with it. And so any integrators would, they started discussing with the different players in the space and decided to choose based on multiple factors. How much customizability they would have, how much ownership they would have, how much alignment they could get from the partner. For example, in our case, with Morpho, we're not deployed on Base, right? So if there is, you could imagine, even if it was not nothing specifically formalized in this, it's in, when we were thinking about deploying into other chains, obviously, if we can see that there is a distribution partner like Coinbase and others building on top of Base that could plug into DeFi, that suddenly creates that makes Base so much more attractive than what I thought it would be, and it was actually a long process for them. They did a very long due diligence. and they ended up like choosing Morpho. I can't share specifically like the deal we have with them because I have confidentiality agreements. All I can say is that I've seen some numbers spread by like the Aave team specifically, etc., that are completely wrong, right? And they're like not even close to be correct. That's unfortunate that some numbers that are supposed to be like first confidential, but also completely inaccurate were spread out. Yeah, that's unfortunately like I have confidentiality agreements. I can't share like any specifics. But yeah.
Okay, so I've got a question for you because you guys have taken this approach of we talked about it on past podcasts that we've done, but a B2B2C approach, right? Where you are this neutral infrastructure. There are going to be fintechs and TradFi institutions and maybe some crypto institutions that build on top of that, and they're going to be the ones that have the relationship with the customer. This is probably a really good example of what that looks like in practice. So, something that I think almost every crypto company has to deal with at some point is this question of who is my customer? And there's roughly two buckets that people like to talk about, which are the crypto natives, and then there are the fintechs and the institutions. And so, the pros and cons of approaching each one of those as your customer set, from my perspective, would be the crypto natives are the lower hanging fruit. Their entire organization is geared towards crypto. If they have a budget of a marketing budget or whatever that you're selling into at $50 million, 100% of that budget is going towards crypto and it's mission critical. Everyone's bought in. The TradFis and the fintechs are much bigger, right? They're these behemoth organizations. They have way bigger budgets that you're selling into, but it's not mission critical. You're generally having to sell crypto in addition to your product or service. And it's just very difficult to get buy-in. And also, maybe a smaller bit of nuance is just the sales cycle is much, much longer in general. And oftentimes, especially young startups, which most crypto companies are, don't have the internal competency of selling into an organization like that. So I would love to get your perspective here a little bit on, again, anything that you can say in terms of, how Morpho thought through identifying its customer here, the pros and cons of having each one of those. And then how did you staff and structure the organization, given fintechs as your customer to, attack that segment?
So first, I think it's a very good question that I've been asking myself a lot over the last the last year, essentially. So what's interesting about the Morpho team is that I've built it the same. I mean, we've built it the same way we've built the Morpho stack, which is in layers. So you have the protocol team working on the protocol, like constantly improving the protocol, like the modules around the protocol and the next versions of the protocol. And then on top of that, you have the off-chain infrastructure team. So essentially like indexing data, collecting data, indexing it, and making it like easily accessible by a front end or by an API. Then you have the different teams of products built on top of that. And so you have two product teams in Morpho. You have the consumer product and the institutional products, right? So what I mean by product is like the set of tools and interfaces that are going to cater to a specific audience, right? And for a long time, we were like, hey, maybe we're just going to focus on the institutional products and we're just going to build the perfect infrastructure for fintechs, for exchanges like Coinbase to build what they want to build. And we're going to provide like them the tools that they need in order to do so. Truth is that Morpho is a network. And the more people you can get in the network and, the more liquidity you can aggregate in your network, the better. And the reality is that a lot of people come to morpho.org and start like using the protocol that way. And so we had to create this consumer product section, which is essentially about creating great consumer experiences around the Morpho protocol, whatever the asset, whatever the market, essentially. And so TLDR is that initially the Morpho interface looked like a Etherscan Explorer, and we wanted to go full, infrastructure mode. Now we're actually shipping a new version, I believe, very soon. Like the public beta should be like in a week or so of our new app, which is much more consumer oriented, because we want to make sure we also capture this segment of the market, because it's going to add value to the network. So you can identify this to the Farcaster strategy, where they have like the Farcaster protocol and the Rockcast app. And the thesis around that is that Farcaster protocol is valuable because you have an initial consumer, essentially like uh, bringing the first users to the protocol and making the state valuable. And once you have this order flow, then you can plug in a large player like Coinbase that can borrow tens of millions already because all this consumer USDC was already deposited in. And so it's tough because you have to play on like those different, like, you have to play both at the same time is my conclusion. Initially, I thought I could do like just institutional. I was wrong. Like I realized that, like so many people were requesting for like using the Morpho app. So yeah, I think that's generally how we've been thinking about it.
Yeah, I completely agree with this. So I think, there are lots of good examples. Frankly, there are good examples in DeFi, but there are also examples. Blockworks has our own analogous challenge here as well. And I think part of the reason for that is just there's a sequencing here, which is the lesson that's been learned broadly in especially things like B2B SaaS is build an enterprise product, right? And there's such a strong draw towards that in crypto because the logic is really simple. It's, hey, we're building financial products. Look at where capital exists today. It's all in institutions, so we should be building a product for that. The challenge is they're not the natural customer set yet, and you need a value add to draw the institutions in because let's be real, they don't care as much or think as much about like the decentralized stuff that we all care about, right? So you need some sort of value proposition. And I think the value proposition that you can offer to institutions is users and liquidity, right? Like that's what they want, a new customer segment that they can build into. So maybe a good example in crypto would be Steve, right? Like Lido and Steve. And they started as a very kind of a retail product for the most part. I don't know what the breakdown of institutional versus retail holders or something like Steve is, but especially in the beginning, I would say it was highly retail oriented. And now, when there's talk about there's going to be some sort of staked ETH ETF, I would guess that Lido has a pretty big leg up because they have an enormous amount of liquidity in that product. So maybe there's like a little bit of an analogy here for Morpho as well. What does the challenge look like? I'm just thinking about like org structure in general and what a sales force has to look like for kind of like a more enterprise, selling into fintechs type thing versus how I would structure maybe more for a more retail based product. I would guess the retail side of things is a little bit more marketing driven. And the fintech stuff is definitely, you got to construct a B2B sales org here. So how do you like deal with the splitting focus and the operational challenges of attacking both of those market segments?
Yeah, so I think that's right. So first, I'm learning along the way. The reality is that Morpho is my first job first, so So, but I'd say what I've come to learn is is pretty obvious things, but retail is driven by good product and good marketing and good essentially like attention that you get, especially in crypto, where so much of like consumer products are like driven by attention. So that's number one. On the institutional side, it's much more like, so as you said, B2B sales, like, which I by the way discovered like, essentially over the last 2 years, where it's really about like figuring out like the org structure of like the player you're targeting and the individual incentive of each contributor inside that org, and then figuring out, at what moment in their career they are, and maybe it makes sense for them to push this and take the risk for you to bring this new innovation in the space, which are things that I had to learn. And then it's about how do we build like the growth team or like the sales team that essentially can go after those players. I generally think that we don't want to get too ahead of ourselves. Like it's very easy to lose a lot of time with B2B sales. So we only would talk to like the low hanging fruits here. Like we don't want to convert people to crypto, or we don't want to convince people that the infrastructure, like people that don't care about the benefits of DeFi, we don't try to convince them, right? Like we only target people that are already convinced, that already are tech native and crypto native enough in order to integrate. Maybe one day we'll take a stab at those players, but it's just we're just a 3 years old company. Like we can't afford to spend 2 years on like closing someone and making sure they finally integrate Morpho in 2 years. So yeah, I guess those have been the biggest challenges. And finally, one that is a bit less stated is just bridging the gap between Ethereum and like DeFi protocols and technically and the stack of like fintechs, and not just fintechs but like others like exchanges or just integrators in general, uh, can require more work, like more open source code around your protocol, more SDKs, more APIs, more indexers. Like at Morpho now we have our own indexers, SDKs for everything. That is a lot of work, and a lot of like we have more and more engineers in the team. But it feels like an endless amount of work that we have to go through in order to bridge the gap and shorten the sales cycle and the integration cycle when getting into like mass distribution.
So that leads into my next question here, which is obviously I know you can't reveal a lot of the specifics of this deal, but could you share at a high level, either for Coinbase or other fintechs or partners that you might be working with here? I want to get a sense of two things, which is one, what is the value proposition of plugging into DeFi from their perspective? Because this is where I feel like the semantics and the wording actually matters. There was a long debate that actually was having on the left curvers, the bell curve Telegram about this, which is, why do people build on something like Ethereum? Is it really this stuff that we've all been told for a long time? Is it are fintechs going to pick where to deploy based on these decentralization sort of metrics, or is it based on users and liquidity? And I would love to get as specific as we can about what the actual value proposition is for how fintechs think about this. And I would also love to get a sense of what the big frictions are for them, because oftentimes the CT mob will say, hey, why aren't we doing more deployments like at X, Y, and Z? And oftentimes there's a long list of technical reasons that you just would not understand at all if you weren't super in the weeds about it. So what's the kind of USP or unique selling proposition of DeFi from the fintech perspective, and then what are the big challenges still?
Right. So I guess the three main ones are, I'd say four main ones are transparency, free code, and state and ownership. So ownership is, okay, you own your infrastructure. You're not going to depend on like other TradFi infrastructure in order to do so. Transparency is that, okay, you can prove your users that you're not doing an FTX-like situation. Code is like, okay, everything is open. So essentially your development costs are smaller. Like you don't have to build the thing. It's already there on the shelf. And then finally, which to me is the most powerful and probably the least understood, I think by far the least understood, is the state. Currently, Coinbase books are segregated from Binance books, that are segregated from Kraken's books, etc., etc. And we know that in finance, the more you aggregate intents, the more you aggregate like order flow, the more efficient you get, the more efficient pricing you get for increasingly large orders. And so imagine a global DEX, right? Like a global book that everyone leverages in order to execute trades on. That would be awesome. Like, and so I think this is what the promise of like Ethereum and decentralized finance in general is that we won't have two times the same book. We'll have one book that is one piece of code, and then every single intent on, for example, for lenders and bars, like every single lender and bar will be aggregated on this specific one in order to provide the best possible rates or offering to users. And that's a bit more abstract than the three first of the USPs, but to me that's the most important one at scale. Obviously, when Coinbase is alone and they're the very first users plugging on a market, the only network effect that they get is that, okay, some people going through the Morpho interface also interact with the same book. But then tomorrow you have also other wallets integrating, like Rainbow Wallet is integrating Morpho. Oh, so they also share the infrastructure with Coinbase now. And so if you take this to the extreme, where you happen to have one internet protocol for lending and borrowing that aggregates all the order flows and makes the most efficient matching between the two needs, like people that wants to generate, interest and people that has the need for financing.
Okay. So, part of the reason I really like this as an analogy as well is it was interesting to watch actually the Trump and Melania coins launch this last weekend, and you looked at the DEX volumes that were happening on Solana, and at one point they got to something like I think it was 25% of Nasdaq, or maybe it was 10% of Nasdaq or something like that, but within spitting distance, and that's a pretty wild thing in metric. And you can kind of flash forward to this vision of the future where a huge use case of crypto is capital markets in general, and that can be basic swapping. It could be borrow lend, and it's global, it's permissionless, it's 24/7. These are characteristics that we all kind of know, but it's interesting to watch them sort of win in real time. And you can imagine the Coinbases of the world, which I've always thought of as a brokerage. And so you can imagine kind of the brokerage originating a lot of that order flow and plugging into this neutral, but obviously much larger liquid global kind of infrastructure layers. So yeah, completely agree on the value proposition there. What about, or sorry, did you have something to say? Then I want to
No,
get
I was just about to say, like, the hard thing about this one is it has to be bootstrapped, right? And it's only, you can only sell it once the state is already there, right?
Right.
And so this is why I'm also glad that sometimes we have like all this madness and this craziness, and we can come back to that. There's obviously a ton of negative aspects to that, and I'm the first like to be sad sometimes about the craziness of crypto. But I will say though that the craziness helps bootstrap like networks such as the one we were just describing for global finance. Is like so hard to bootstrap like a global book for all humanity, right? And only a crazy space like crypto could bootstrap it almost.
I agree. I also I'm slightly less bothered about this than I used to be. When it's actually funny, when I first got into the space as well, it used to bother me quite a bit, the unseriousness of something like crypto. And I used to think a lot about the stigma and how negative it was and yada yada. I worry a lot less about that now. Maybe just because I've seen how much crypto has grown during that period of time. Also, I think there's something about I keep using this word sequencing, but I've watched that basically this craziness and the speculation, et cetera, are actually really helpful for bootstrapping early network effects and liquidity and mind share, et cetera. That doesn't mean the value proposition has to stay like that over time. I would imagine over time that as crypto gets more and more serious, and as funny as it is, right? Like the sitting president of the United States launched a meme coin. I mean, at some level, right, we can all say that's silly and it's a meme coin, but it is some indication of adoption here. And eventually the silly speculative stuff turns into, once there's enough capital and attention, turns to more serious stuff. And then on a level of, hey, where do you want to spend your career? Crypto's pretty fun. It's like fun, and it's dynamic, and it's fast moving, and it's young. And I don't know. I think there's going to be plenty of time for us to be, kind of more serious and buttoned up, et cetera. But I don't know. I'm going off on a tangent here, but
I think you can agree with a lot of that. Like, there's really like this like Ethereum pixie dust as well that sometimes it's hard to dissociate from like all the financial madness, but there is definitely a vibe to that is unique.
Yeah. Let's talk about the frictions of getting back to the original question of, okay, this is the unique selling point here. What are the frictions that the Coinbases or fintechs of the world have, in integrating DeFi or working with DeFi protocols today?
Well, I don't think they're like critical. Like, okay, so a few things here. I think the first one in the past was scalability. Like, it was just too expensive to have every consumer like pay the gas of like integrating with DeFi. That was solved with L2s, with things like Solana and other chains. Now, the second biggest blocker was account abstraction. And I think this is where like, Coinbase has released a lot of like different tools, like, the different ERCs that they've worked or contributed to, essentially like smart accounts and APIs in order to be able to like control or interact with those like smart wallets. And I think this was the biggest like bridge, gap to bridge, essentially. Then the rest, frankly, is just, maybe like, obviously when you're like in a centralized exchange, people are, the developers tend to use more centralized tech. So there is a little bit of knowledge to get from like interacting with smart contracts, because it's obviously like a different field. I don't think there is like any major blocker now. The biggest one that still exists is really account abstraction. Because there is really a lack of standard here. Like, we really need something that, could be unique to everybody. It's not been the case at all. And I personally found that the most recent EAPs are not even satisfying still. I think we'll get there eventually, um, but yeah. So I think that's the biggest piece is like working with a kind of abstraction and just having devs that have the knowledge on how to integrate decentralized tech. I'm hopeful that with open source and standardization is just, the gap will tighten over time very naturally. And the work will only have to be done once by one integrator, and then the second integrator will be easier again and again. And we'll just compound on open source like we always did. And yeah, I mean, that's the magic of open source software. It will be easier and easier.
Paul, talk to us a little bit about, could you just give us like the most up-to-date statistics here on so this announcement is just about a week old now. Like, what has the uptake and demand been so far on the product? I know you can't comment on this. It was fun to watch the Morpho token do very well on the day of. I think it pumped something like 20 or 30%. I know you can't comment on any of that, but I would like to just connect for listeners. I think people were really excited about this, and it showed maybe a validation of Morpho's B2B2C strategy here, and Coinbase is a massive integration. And I just want to give a sense of listeners for what the traction is and what you sort of expect if you have any internal targets on this for the year.
Yeah, so I think to me, like, this could be massive, like, frankly. Like, I think giving access to loans from their, like, and financing from their crypto to, like, the hundreds of millions of users that Coinbase has huge potential. Now, the rollout has to be progressive, right? You can't like immediately give access to like all the 100 million of users of Coinbase. Right. So I believe they're starting with an extremely gated launch with like very, very few users. I think this is just like some US non-New York users and maybe like only 1% of like the total, etc. I think we still had like decent activity. I don't want to say fake numbers. I'm not sure about the numbers top of mind. It's like few millions essentially of activity. But I think, like Coinbase approaches product in a very thoughtful way. Like, they want to collect feedback in as much as they can, improve the product, and then, progressively roll out to more users. And, that's going to be I think a quite long cycle. But yeah, I'm very I'm very optimistic about like the overall adoption. I don't know if you had the chance to test it or not, but it's just really great.
I'm in New York. I'm in New York, yeah. Paul.
but it's been like it's very, very, very good.
Yeah.
They've done an amazing job. I've been very impressed. Like, I mean, by the way, just a quick shout out to Coinbase team. Like, they're a public company with like 4,000 employees, and they're shipping innovative stuff at the pace of, I wouldn't say at the pace of a startup. They're obviously slower, but they're, for a big public company, they're really doing well.
I completely agree. I love to give Coinbase shout outs whenever possible because they, going into 2022, when the market changed and everything, they were a little bit bloated. They had more employees. Everyone was kind of like, they botched the launch of their NFT exchange, yada, yada. And they have just been, I mean, it externally to look like they have just done all of the right stuff. They put the right team in place. They have focus. They have they're shipping actually useful things. Base has been doing extremely well, and integrations with DeFi protocols like Morpho, I think is just super exciting and cool to watch as a crypto native that wants to see this stuff work and people do things on chain. So yeah, massive shout out to Coinbase here for sure. Okay, the other question that I had for you just in general is. As again, no state secrets here, so always just tell me stuff that you can't talk about. But I'm almost trying to imagine this from the perspective of I'm evaluating Morpho, the protocol, as an analyst might, on an earnings call, and I'm trying to get a sense of what are the metrics here that are going to move Morpho, and just internally how you guys think about health metrics for the protocol. Right? Is it laser focused on deposits? Should we be paying attention to other big integrations from the Coinbases of the world, et cetera? Like, if I was just an analyst trying to get a sense of, the overall health metric and progression of the company, what should I be looking at?
So that's a good question. I think the value creation of Morpho is the target is pretty clear. Is we want to be the internet protocol for lending, Right? So what does that mean? That means people have a need for financing. People have an excess of capital. They want to generate interest. And we want to facilitate as much as possible by bringing together the two sides of the markets at one place, which is the Morpho protocol. So the metric that immediately derives from that is the interest, generated by the protocol, like how much interest have been generated, how much loans multiplied by essentially like the price of the loan. So the interest generated. And I think, this is probably, it's very hard to quantify, but what exactly like we're aiming for. But I think this is probably the metric that is best representing the percentage of achievement that we have in our mission. I will say though that Morpho's goal, again, is Morpho's approach is much more, as as an infrastructure and not as a managed product, right? So we don't, look so much about how much of the current crypto market share we have compared to Aave, for example, or like the crypto consumer user base. We more look at, what we always have in mind is really finance as a whole, like just lending and borrowing as a whole. Right. And how can we provide infrastructure for everybody? And what's the path in order to get there? And obviously it starts with crypto consumer base or user base. But really like every step of the way, we're like, okay, this is just an intermediate step in order to get to a more general protocol, an even more global protocol that's going to be able to connect even more opportunities and integrate in even more like, institutions. And so obviously like everybody should do like their own research, and I can't provide like any, financial advice, etc. But the way I think personally about Morpho is really in terms of like how much connection have we, how much lending infrastructure we've been able to replace in the world of finance, and how much interest have been generated overall is more like the way I like to think about it. I will also say though that we, it's probably the good way to think about it from a builder perspective. From a like token perspective, I have really no idea. And also we have like literally zero focus internally on Morpho and like those kind of things. So yeah, it's really like the builder oriented, like, metrics, I would say.
I understand. Okay. So one more question for you on this side of things, which is, actually, you know what? I want to get to this this kind of American DeFi point here because you guys are obviously based out of France, so uniquely suited to comment on the future of finance or the future of France here, right? But there's obviously been a big pull back towards the United States as well, and I'm curious how you think about it as a founder and a builder of a DeFi product here, where you have a really large market in the form of the United States actively courting DeFi here. And there's been a lot of calls for American DeFi. Maybe you could define for listeners in your perspective what that actually means. Is that like fluff and kind of a catchphrase? Is there more substance to it, do you ultimately think? And how would it impact the DeFi space if the US started to actually impose good regulation, frankly, on DeFi protocols for the first time? Like, what would that do to the market?
I don't have a deep point of view on the question, but essentially my mental model before was like, hey, the biggest legal and regulatory risk in crypto was coming from the US, right? And it looked like this is not going to be the case anymore, right? And so this is, how it changes for a European project. I will say though that I really see DeFi as a global thing. And I really think of it as, again, same parallels like internet protocols that are not married to one specific regulation or jurisdiction. I do think it will matter a lot for apps. For protocols, less so. And I don't know if you've read this article from Miles Jennings, who's like the legal GC like at A16Z, which is called Regulate Apps, Not Protocols. I think it's the most relevant legal mental model someone could have about crypto and DeFi in general is that protocols are unopinionated. Protocols are like SMTP, HTTP. They should be global to connect the different peoples around the world. And the whole purpose is to be standardized, whoever you are in the world, right? And wherever you are. And then apps, the way you interact and the things you do, then, maybe depending on the jurisdiction where you are, you get imposed different jurisdictions. And I think to this regard is going to, US regulations will help a lot for US like products, right? For protocols, yeah, I think it removes the risk, obviously, but I don't see how it impacts us much more than that. Like we've been recruiting a lot in the US recently is also a fact. Maybe I should state. We're also looking to, maybe like, at some point like have an entity there or like an office or something that's still, speculative and hypothetical, but that's the idea. So yeah.
How do you think about, there's a multitude of different perspectives like this, and I don't know what your, I would just love to get your take on this in general about, so when something happens like the Trump meme coin, right? You almost always in crypto get two opposing takes here, which is one, this is silly. And this undermines the credibility of what we're trying to do as an industry. And it doesn't feel like this has long-term legs. And people have been screaming this, including myself at times, about meme coins for the last 2 years. But if you miss meme coins, as a chain, your activity metrics are probably suffering. And if you miss it as an investor, you might have underperformed because there's like 4 buckets of things that have done well, to be honest. So, how do you kind of think about, from your perspective, as looking at something like this, is this is a silly thing that I should be maybe disregarding versus having maybe a more open mind and saying maybe there's something more real here that I'm fully understanding at the time? Or to be honest, the kind of unsaid thing of, even if it's unsaid or even if it's silly and even if it's not going to last, I can't afford to be completely, out of what's going to be generating fees or positive metrics for a period of 3 years, because guess what? As a founder, sometimes you don't have 3 years, right, to wait for your metrics to turn around. So how do you balance these two opposing forces that I feel like every founder at some point has to deal with in crypto?
So just to make sure I get the two forces correctly, is like one is like, yeah, can you just outline like the
Yeah,
two
it's just like, all right, there are lots of kind of examples of what I would say is like silly behavior that looks like all right, there's someone said this to me like 4 or 5 years ago in crypto, and I guess it's an old Web 2 phrase, which is you're at the mercy of your stupidest competitor. And actually maybe on the, it's like, you probably know exactly what I mean. And there was a dynamic actually in between. This is Mike's personal opinion. I don't have access to a lot of data here, but I always felt a little bit like BlockFi was at the mercy of its stupidest competitor in the form of Celsius, where I think Celsius maybe pushed BlockFi to take some undue risk than they otherwise would have. And Blockworks has had these examples as well, where competitors were making kind of silly decisions or taking money that they didn't publicly reveal, and it looked like we were kind of losing for a long period of time before maybe a more sound framework was ultimately vindicated. And I would imagine you have to deal with these things as well, where you look at these kind of things that look like they might be fleeting trends, and meme coins are a good example, where half the industry thinks it's bad and it's an optics image and a problem, but there are protocols like Pump.Fun and Solana that have leaned in and fully accepted that, and it's led to big results. And you could say maybe this is going to be a 2-year long period, and ultimately that's all going to go to zero, and they'll be the worse off for having accepted it. It's just very difficult to, or maybe meme coins are much more enduring than we all think, and everyone's going to launch a coin, and there's something more serious about meme coins that we just don't fully understand at this time because it hasn't played out yet. And actually, that's going to be a great decision. So, I would imagine that you have parallels or analogs for Morpho's business, and I'm just wondering how you think about dividing up, kind of like how do you assess different opportunities and whether they're worth chasing?
like Morpho's culture has been a lot about like operating from first principles, and sometimes it's hard to reconcile like the madness of crypto and some of the things that are happening in crypto with what we're trying to achieve. Frankly, meme coin is an example. Like we recognize some of the value of the craziness. Like, to be clear, like we have a token and recognize that it's an incredibly powerful tool to bootstrap network effects, right? And bootstrap lending markets and getting lenders and getting borrowers. And so we're going to use this as as a tool in order to do so. That said, I have to say, like, all this, I don't think like all the craziness that is happening in crypto must be rational. And like I'm having a hard time agreeing with people saying that, at the end of the day, maybe it's justified. Maybe there is like some fundamental value to, like, the nihilism or like trading meme coins, etc. I think the reality is that, people trading on Pump.fun have like a very negative, like, EV, like, in general, and a lot of people in there are losing money, and unfortunately it's the people with the least, like, like, with the most asymmetry of information, like, and I think that's the truth. And my moral sense is more like, hey, um, is this good? When I ask myself, like, is this creating value in general in a fair way? And for now, for most of it, and more, by the way, these days, I feel like we're entering a part of the cycle where um, crypto is breaking some lines where it's not being useful at all, and it can be detrimental to some people. Maybe not now because, like, everything is going up, and maybe I'll be proven wrong because everything will stay up forever. But I doubt. So anyway, and I'm just saying that there is some very good things that I can recognize, like, we unleash innovation. Maybe some unnecessary regulation will be removed, which will enable entrepreneurs to take more risk, innovate more, etc. But I do think that at the end of the day, we have to be thoughtful about, like, the things we do here, because the reality is that a lot of people will again lose money, and unfortunately, that's not the most, like, people that had all the cards in hand to actually know what they were going to do. Essentially, it's a half baked thought, by the way. I'm not, like, super convinced about what I'm saying here.
And I don't want to get too philosophical here either, but I've thought about this as well quite a bit. And I think one of the challenges when it comes to something like finance is that mostly people who are retail people don't make good financial decisions, right? Finance is like operating, it's like operating heavy machinery. You need to be trained in it. Most people aren't trained in it. Everyone has to deal with finance in their lives because they have to manage their personal finances, and people mostly make bad decisions. Even, Robinhood doesn't have to release this stuff, but I think there's more regulation over in Europe. So eToro, the EU equivalent, actually has to say when trading options, like 86% of people that trade options on that platform lose money. I would guess it's probably something relatively similar with something like Pump.fun.
Just to react to that, I agree. And my hope is that the free market is going to solve this. And because we have open and transparent infrastructure, inevitably we're going to have builders that are going to cater to the needs of retails and that are going to provide the transparency, and through reputation scores, we'll be able to essentially solve the fact that all the retail is losing a ton of money. I think we'll have to solve this eventually. It's just like, for now, we haven't, proved so much in this. And I think it's really unfortunate in my opinion, but yeah.
Yeah. I hope so too. I also, though, it might be the reason why regulation exists in general. And, you could imagine here would be a hypothetical outcome for you, or this might be the hypothetical reality. I don't have enough confidence in this to say, but it might be that more regulation and managing outcomes leads to a better, albeit more unfair, by the letter of the law, outcome for retail, right? Versus if you have something which is completely fair and completely open and anyone can do anything, it might actually lead to a worse outcome. And I would guess in the long arc of history, that's what people have roughly figured out when it comes to finance. And I would guess that's why, I know people have a lot of conspiracy theories about accredited investor laws and whether it's just keeping the rich. And I don't know. I always assume with these types of things, maybe naively, that there's a good reason why they exist, and generally they serve a purpose. And I guess we'll have to figure out our own balance.
Regulations are, in my personal opinion, are driven by good intention, but often result in, like, introducing pro-business, like, situations where they're going to protect specific situations and businesses and give like an unfair advantage to some players, even though that was not the original intent. In some cases, there is some lobbying, and it can be the case. But I do think in some cases there is really good intent that is put in there in order to protect people. But turns out the regulation was not as well thought through, and it introduces inefficiencies in the market. On the opposite side, I do think that a completely free market, eventually, thanks to technology, will be able to protect like retails very well. I think the reality is that right now, the free market has not yet is yet to make its proof in protecting retail traders. And I do think, by the way, reputations of like protocols of like financial instruments is really a big problem to solve, because if you don't have like, imagine a world where you don't have regulation, like you need something to show to the user to say, oh, this is a trusted financial instrument, or this is a trusted action that you can do, and you won't be losing like too much money, or like those kind of things. But, obviously very hard to get to.
Yeah. Paul, this has been a fascinating conversation. I'm glad we got to end it on a little bit of a philosophical lesson level here for listeners. If folks want to find out more about Morpho, or if you are ex-New York and you want to check out, this new lending product on Coinbase, what's the best way for listeners to learn more?
Morpho.org for Morpho-related stuff. For the Coinbase thing, I guess Coinbase.com, maybe /loans. I guess Google Coinbase loan Morpho, and you'll find out.
Awesome. Cool, man. Well, it's always great to talk to you. I always learn something. So thank you very much for coming on, and we'll have to do it again sometime soon.